Hey guys, our friend Marshall Kosloff, he's going to be conducting interviews with experts and newsmakers for us here on the Breaking Points channel. We're really excited.
Yep, here it is.
Hey, Breaking Points. This is Marshall Kosloff. You probably recognize me from our State of the Union coverage earlier this week. If you don't know me from there, I am Saagar's co-host at The Realignment. It's our podcast. You should go check it out. We've also had a great episode with the guest today, so you could check that out as well too afterwards. So here's the deal. I'm going to start doing content for Breaking Points. We're interested in speaking with authors, figures, activists, politicians who can give us a bit of a deeper angle on the news and what's going on there. So to kick off this title segment, I immediately thought of Michael Shellenberger. Michael has written a book, Apocalypse Never. It's about climate change, energy policy, and he just wrote a really interesting piece for Barry Weiss's Substack called The West's Green Delusions Empowered Putin. So Michael, welcome to Breaking Points.
Thanks for having me.
Point out at the start of your piece that there are a variety of angles one could take when arguing for why exactly Putin was able to invade Ukraine, but you take a specific angle related to energy policy. What's your argument?
Well, the argument is that the point that I start with is just that Putin was not deterred by Europe or the West from invading Ukraine. He did not obviously fear economic sanctions, and he turned out to be right not to fear them because they carved out energy exports, which is the main way that Russia gets hard foreign currency. So yes, we've heard a lot about sanctions on banking, but as long as Russia can sell its coal, oil, and natural gas to Europe and the world, it's going to continue to be able to finance its war, finance its economy. And the reason for that, I point out, is that, just 15 years ago, Europe produced 3 times more natural gas than Russia currently exports. Those fortunes have shifted. Climate activists in Europe prevented the expansion of natural gas production, including by fracking. Turns out there's actually quite a bit of shale in Europe that it could have been using. And it just grew heavily dependent on Russia. And so, in fact, the role that Russia has in its control over European energy supplies is only going to increase, I believe, in the coming months. I think it's possible, if not probable, that President Biden will restrict oil exports. If he does that, that will further strengthen the hand of Putin to be able to reward nations that are neutral or supportive of him with oil exports. So, really, I think Putin is playing a long game. He viewed taking Ukraine as essential to Russia's survival. He viewed gaining control, a significant amount of control and influence over Europe through energy supplies as central to that strategy.
Something I appreciated in the piece was your description of Europe's energy mix when it comes to energy sources. So could you describe what the energy picture looks like in Western Europe, and then what percentage of that roughly is comprised of Russian dependency?
Sure. I mean, just to give you a sense of it, Germany depends on Russia for over 50% of its natural gas and oil, for around 20% of its coal. In the rest of Europe, you could just think of it as about a third of Europe's energy imports coming from Russia. That's more than enough for Russia to play a decisive role, particularly when you consider how much of that energy is traded on the margins. So it's really, Russia has just, and one of the things I point out is that Europe just consumes significantly more energy than it produces, and Russia produces significantly more energy than it consumes. And that's not, that hasn't always been that way. As I mentioned, that's really been a change over the last 2 decades. And a big part of the reason is that Europe has been either shutting down its nuclear power plants, particularly in Germany, or not building them. And it's been basically depriving itself of 2 important low carbon or zero carbon energy sources, supposedly in the name of climate change. But that has resulted in Putin gaining a stronger hand. I think it's the equivalent of basically the West was soft. Its head was in the clouds. Putin's feet were firmly on the ground. Putin is focused on realpolitik, and I think Europe, like many in the West, were caught up in delusions, utopian fantasies of harmonizing human societies with nature through renewables. I think that we're at the end of an era, not just the end of the post-Cold War era, but really the end of the post-war era. And I think Putin saw that coming and the West did not.
So as a person who really came up in the environmental movement, it's not that you're arguing against the usage of renewables here. That said, given the harder edged energy discussion you're indicating we're moving towards, what would you describe the present state of renewable energy, clean energy that's not nuclear, and what mix in an ideal world would that look like?
Sure. And, renewables is not a great category because it combines so many different technologies, but I'm a big defender of hydroelectric dams. Hydroelectric dams were how we lifted much of the American South out of poverty through the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's, a big source of energy for Europe, particularly Northern Europe. Sweden has sort of the perfect electrical grid because it's about 40% nuclear and about 50% hydroelectric. And hydro has all sorts of advantages, including to be able to ramp up and down to meet changing demand. What you want from electricity in general is you want supply and demand to be perfectly matched. That's why electricity becomes cheap, is that you don't have to pay for the cost of storage. Every time you take electricity out of the system or put it back in, you're paying 2 energy penalties, which is very expensive. So I'm a big supporter of hydroelectric dams. They can have a big negative environmental impact, but they've been a way that poor countries lift themselves out of poverty. But when you get to weather-dependent renewables, particularly solar panels and wind turbines, you start to run into much bigger problems. The first one is just that they require significantly more land than either natural gas or nuclear plants. Land is actually quite scarce in Western Europe, more so certainly than it is in the United States, but they need, somewhere between 500 and 800 times more land. The other problem is that we don't make solar panels really in the West anymore. The vast majority, over 90% of the raw materials for solar panels comes from China. We now know that those solar panels became cheaper, not because of greater efficiencies in converting sunlight into electricity, but rather because they were being made in factories that used conscripted labor from Uyghur Muslims. Which is a huge problem and something that, in fact, the Biden administration and Congress has been trying to figure out what to do about. But then the other fundamental question is just that because they're weather dependent, you have to always have backup power. You have to have 100% backup power at any time so that when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, you have something else to replace it. And that's what we saw happen in Germany last year. The first half of last year, there just wasn't very much wind. And so carbon emissions increased by 25%. Similarly, it's been a pretty low wind year across Europe. And so that increased demand for natural gas and it came at a time when supplies were short. So we have solar panels in our backyard. I don't have any spiritual opposition to solar panels by any means, but I think that we've kind of reached the limit, certainly in California and in Germany and much of the Western world, in terms of how much more renewables we can do. And I think what the Ukraine situation shows and the Russia situation shows is that renewables just sort of sit on top of your electrical grid. They don't replace fossil fuels. They can substitute for some of the fuel that's used, but you still need those fossil fuel power plants operating, or some other power plant, nuclear plants, for example, to have cheap and reliable electricity.
So you critique a lot of what you're describing as head in the clouds, green ideology. In the specific case of Germany, what's so interesting to this mix, though, is that the German decision, I think this is where the audience is going to be most sympathetic to this argument, was driven by Fukushima in 2011, this fear that nuclear energy, this isn't just a 3 Mile Island issue in the 70s. This is a dangerous source of power, separate from the climate change argument, separate from the nuclear waste argument. And then, of course, in the news, just earlier this week, you had the incident at the Ukrainian nuclear plant as Russian forces invaded. Now, at this point, it's been stated that the threat was overblown relative to what we saw in the images. It's important to be grounded with that. But I just know for a fact a lot of the audience members are going to have non-climate change, not even head in the clouds renewable arguments, but just basic safety arguments. How do you think we should sort through that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, look, nuclear is a really serious technology. Its primary purpose and its first purpose was as weapons. They're devastating weapons. We should be scared of nuclear weapons. That's how nuclear weapons work. The word deterrence means to scare away. So we know that nuclear weapons are absolutely terrifying. They are one of the few ways that we can imagine the end of human civilization. So everybody has an absolute right to be concerned about nuclear weapons. We've also known since 1945 that we can't just get rid of them. that two countries that have nuclear weapons and try to get rid of them, but then go to war would just reconstruct their weapons. So we're either, it's either a cursed blessing or a blessed curse that we have this really powerful technology. The flip side of it is that it's a relatively cheap, reliable source of zero carbon power. In my view, and in the view of many other people, nuclear is really the only way that you really get to sustainability, because with nuclear, you can have 100% carbon-free electricity, plus you can produce fresh water from your oceans, and you can produce hydrogen gas, which, unless we're going to just become newly dependent on lithium imported from Bolivia and other parts of the world, we're ultimately going to need for transportation, but also potentially heating and cooking. So nuclear offers all these benefits on the energy side. Obviously, anytime there's some sort of military action around a nuclear power plant, as we saw last night, people are alarmed. I don't think, I think there's very few cases where panic is merited. Panic, of course, means unthinking action and behavior. We saw some of that panic, but the Russians, of course, quickly took the plant. The fire was in an administrative building. There's just a lot of things about nuclear that people still don't understand. Like, a power plant is the whole site. It's not just the reactors. The reactors are where the nuclear fuel rods, where the atoms are splitting, creating heat. They were never threatened. There was never a loss of coolant, which is how reactors melt down. So it was I was tweeting about it last night. I'll probably write something about it. So I do think heightened concern around nuclear is important, but I think that the panic has been really dangerous. And, I think the bottom line is, if you want to be less dependent on Russian exports, if Europe wants to have greater energy security, it's going to need to keep operating its nuclear plants and build some additional ones. I will say the technology is improving. I'm not a huge fan of radical changes to the design of nuclear plants, because I do think that can make them more expensive, but we have increasingly good fuels. We're not quite there yet with the fuels being meltdown proof, but that's where it's headed. So the holy grail really is that you start to get nuclear plants that can withstand meltdowns that go into existing nuclear power reactors.
So this is the question on everyone's mind, no doubt. There are two pressing concerns that one can have: left, right, center. Either one, you think that there is a climate emergency that nuclear power can help by being this zero carbon source of energy. Even natural gas is cleaner than coal, so it also helps that in the right direction too. So there's that issue. And then there's also the issue of, wow, there's a security concern when it comes to Russian dependency. So when you're talking about this diversifying away from carbon, building more secure type of clean energy than just renewables, but then when you're talking about pivoting away from Russia, how quickly can this come about, especially in the European context?
Not quickly enough. I think we can all agree. I mean, that's why, there's this, on the one hand, you're sort of like, yeah, we should stop importing Russian oil. That sounds like a really moral thing to do. How could you not support that? And then you realize, well, because it could really cause oil prices to rise very high. If oil prices rise to $200 a barrel, high oil prices are often what triggers global recessions. Global recessions are really bad for people and really harmful. So you don't want to have a global recession. Expensive energy makes everything in the economy expensive. That's the bottom line. So it will take some time. Now you can get, we can, in the United States, because we're blessed with a lot of shale that we're fracking for oil and gas, you can ramp up oil and gas production within a matter of weeks. The problem is that we don't have, the refineries need to be retrofitted to handle more of our own light sweet crude that comes out of the shales. Also, you need the liquefied natural gas, or LNG, terminals for cooling the gas and liquefying it and then putting it on special ships and moving it to Europe. Those things take time. I mean, I think we saw over the last decade, so-called climate activists blocking pipelines, blocking LNG terminals, preventing the expansion of oil and gas in the United States. I think that was a huge mistake. Ironically, one of the consequences of the natural gas shortage over the last 6 months has been that the whole world has burned more coal, which produces twice as much carbon emissions as natural gas does. Nuclear plants, similarly, they take, if you have experience building them, they can be built in as little as 5 years. But if you don't have experience, they can go 10 years or longer. So we're not in a great position. I think that the bottom line is that more needs to be done to get oil and gas producing. The Biden administration has made this point that there's a bunch of permits that the oil and gas industry has that they don't appear to be using. I think there's people in the oil and gas industry that are enjoying the high prices, that want to make the money, but there are national security concerns here. And I would like to see the Biden administration doing more to encourage that production. In terms of nuclear in Europe, I think it's a no-brainer that they should stop shutting down their nuclear plants. It appears to be the case that the 3 nuclear reactors that Germany shut down at the end of last year, that nothing has been done to them other than powering them down. And that means they could be restarted. Well, that's a significant amount of electricity. Think of it as about 1 million homes can be powered per reactor. So you're talking about a significant amount of additional energy. But look, we saw in Germany, they're saying they're willing to burn more coal in order to reduce their dependence on Russian energy imports. So, it's the worst of many options, but ultimately we're going to have to produce much more energy domestically and encourage Europe to do the same thing.
And to sum everything up, I would put you in this school of thought that's climate realism when it comes to these things. Seems like we have to balance a couple of things here. We have to balance, once again, environmental risk. So this is what you're talking about with hydroelectric power. We're talking about this with nuclear waste. You have to balance security risk when it comes to Putin, energy independence. And then you have to balance, of course, just the need to have a proper energy mix itself. How do you think we can come about, and not just like the sheer percentages, because that's hard to calculate, every country is different. What is the mental / ideological approach we should take to coming up with that answer in each of our cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the term climate realist. I also think, similarly, it's to have a calm view, alert but calm towards these issues. That includes nuclear. On climate change, climate change is real. All else being equal, we shouldn't want temperatures to rise. That means we should try to keep emissions as low as possible, but not at the expense of our energy security. A number of climate trends are actually going in the right direction. The United States reduced its carbon emissions 22% between 2005 and 2020. That was mostly due to the switch from coal to natural gas. We've also seen declining natural disasters over the last 20 years just because societies are becoming more resilient. So again, we don't want to see high temperatures, but that's going to mean doing more natural gas, not less. Similarly, with nuclear is super sensitive technology. It does pose all sorts of risks. It turns out that the operation of nuclear power plants is the safest way to make electricity, but it's also the case that nuclear weapons are some of the most dangerous objects on Earth. But I don't think that either climate change or nuclear are best dealt with in this kind of panicky and manic and somewhat hysterical mode that we've been dealing with them, really nuclear for 75 years, but climate change for the last 30. I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the end of an era. It's clearly the end of the post-Cold War era, but I think it's also the end of the post-war era. It appears to be that the whole world is reverting back to nationalism and national trading blocs. And I think that in some ways it's unfortunate, but in some ways that's just the reality of it. And I think those of us that really love, liberal democracy, that love Western civilization, that don't want to live in a Chinese or Russian style dictatorship with curtailed freedoms and rights, I think it is a time for us to get a bit more hard-headed and clear-eyed in terms of the need to increase domestic energy production. I think what we saw with the fracking revolution is that, there are some negative consequences, but overall, natural gas is just a superior fuel to coal, and nuclear, all else being equal, is a superior way to generate energy than oil, gas, or coal. So I think getting our heads around the fact that nuclear is better than gas and gas is better than coal, and we should be producing more of them, certainly for ourselves, but also for our allies. That's the right direction to go in, both in terms of climate change, air pollution, as well as energy security.
Well, I suggest to everyone, if they'd like to learn more about Michael's work, check out his piece at Barry Weiss's Substack. Unlike most things this day, this is not paywalled, so you can actually go read it as well there too. Michael, thank you so much for joining us on Breaking Points.
Thanks for having me, Marshall.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.